My cousin stole my recipe, but the judges chose mine. Hi everyone! Before we get into today's video, I need your help. We've noticed that the channel's reach has been dropping a bit, and one of the best ways you can support us is by subscribing. It's quick, free, and helps us keep bringing you new and interesting stories. Your support means the world to us, and together, we can grow this channel. Thank you so much. Now let's get to today's story. I'm writing from a temporary account for obvious reasons, and I've changed some details to protect my anonymity. The scent of cardamom and rosewater still lingers in my memory from that Sunday afternoon when everything changed. I was in my grandmother's kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd learned to cook as a child, where the worn wooden spoons held decades of family stories, and where the cast-iron skillet had been seasoned by 3 generations of women who understood that food was love made tangible. I remember the exact moment I created it, my signature dish that would later become the center of the biggest betrayal I'd ever experienced. The autumn light was filtering through the gauze curtains, casting golden shadows across the marble countertop where I was working on what I believed would be my masterpiece. Honey-glazed lamb with pomegranate molasses, served over saffron-infused bulgur with candied walnuts and fresh herbs. It wasn't just a recipe. It was a symphony of flavors that told the story of our Middle Eastern heritage while embracing the techniques I'd learned in culinary school. Cooking had always been my language of love. When words failed me, when emotions ran too deep to express, I turned to my kitchen. Every dish I created carried a piece of my soul. Every seasoning was chosen with the same care a poet selects words. My family knew this about me. They'd gather around my table, faces bright with anticipation, knowing that whatever I placed before them would be more than just food. It would be an experience, a memory, a moment of pure connection. My cousin Daniel had always been part of these gatherings. 2 years older than me, he'd grown up in the same neighborhood, shared the same grandmother's stories, breathed in the same aromas that shaped our childhood. But where I found joy in the process of creation, Daniel seemed to find only competition. His compliments always came wrapped in subtle comparisons, his praise tinged with an edge that made me wonder if he truly celebrated my successes or simply tolerated them. "You always were the lucky one, Sofia," he'd say with that smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Everything just comes so naturally to you." But it wasn't luck, and it certainly wasn't natural. Every technique I'd mastered came from hours of practice, from burned dinners and collapsed soufflés, from nights spent reading cookbooks until my eyes burned and experimenting with flavor combinations that more often than not ended up in the garbage disposal. What Daniel saw as effortless was actually the result of passionate dedication, of treating every meal as both a challenge and an opportunity to grow. The family dynamics had always been complex. Daniel's mother, my father's sister, had never quite gotten over the fact that my father had inherited grandmother's house, and, with it, the kitchen that had been the heart of our family's culinary traditions. There was an undercurrent of resentment that ran through family gatherings, like a bitter aftertaste, never spoken aloud, but always present in the careful way conversations were navigated, in the forced smiles that followed my aunt's passive-aggressive comments about some people getting all the advantages. Daniel absorbed this resentment like a sponge absorbs water, letting it flavor his interactions with me in ways that became more apparent as we grew older. During family dinners, he'd make jokes about my fancy cooking, mocking the care I took in presentation or the time I spent perfecting techniques. When relatives praised a dish I'd prepared, he'd quickly change the subject or make some comment about how simple home cooking was just as good as all that complicated stuff. But despite the undertones of jealousy, I genuinely believed we had a good relationship. We'd text each other regularly, share family gossip, laugh about childhood memories. When I started experimenting with that lamb recipe, he was one of the first people I told about it. I remember his excitement seemed genuine when I described the flavor profile I was working toward, how he asked detailed questions about my process, how he even volunteered to be a taste tester. "You should really write this down," he'd said after I described the complex marinade process. "Something this special deserves to be preserved properly." I was touched by his interest. For the first time in years, it felt like we were connecting over something I was passionate about rather than competing over it. I started sharing more details with him, explaining the delicate balance of sweet and savory, the way the pomegranate molasses created depth without overwhelming the lamb's natural flavor, the technique for achieving the perfect glaze that would caramelize without burning. The recipe evolved over several months. Each time I made it, I'd adjust something small, a pinch more sumac, a different approach to the bulgur, a variation in the herb mixture. I kept detailed notes in a leather-bound journal that had belonged to my grandmother, writing not just measurements, but observations about timing, temperature, the way different ingredients reacted to each other. It was more than a recipe, it was a documentation of a creative journey. Daniel started showing up more often during these experimental sessions. At first, I was delighted by his newfound interest in cooking. He'd watch intently as I worked, asking questions that seemed to come from genuine curiosity. He'd help with prep work, chopping vegetables while I tended to the more complex elements of the dish. He even started bringing his own notebook, claiming he wanted to start taking cooking more seriously. "I've always admired how creative you are," he told me one evening as we cleaned up after a particularly successful iteration of the lamb dish. "I wish I had your natural instincts for this kind of thing." "It's not instinct," I replied, scraping the marinade bowl clean. "It's just practice and paying attention. You could totally do this if you wanted to." He smiled then, that same smile that never quite reached his eyes, but I was too caught up in my excitement about the recipe to notice the calculating look that flickered across his features. The breakthrough came on a rainy Thursday evening in late October. I'd been struggling with the glaze consistency. It was either too thick or too thin, never quite achieving that perfect glossy coating that would make the dish restaurant-worthy. After dozens of attempts, I finally discovered the secret. A tiny amount of honey mixed with the pomegranate molasses, heated to a precise temperature, and whisked in a specific way that created an emulsion that coated the lamb like liquid silk. I was so excited by this discovery that I called Daniel immediately. "I figured it out!" I practically shouted into the phone. "The glaze! I know what I was doing wrong." "That's amazing," he said, and for once his enthusiasm sounded completely genuine. "You have to show me. Can I come over this weekend?" That Saturday, I walked him through the entire process, from start to finish. I showed him every step, every technique, every small detail that made the difference between a good dish and an extraordinary one. I even let him practice the glaze technique himself, guiding his hands as he whisked, sharing the exact timing and temperature that had taken me months to perfect. "This is incredible," he said as we sat down to eat the finished product. "This could win competitions, Sofia. This could make you famous." I laughed at his dramatic assessment, but privately, I agreed. The dish was special. It represented everything I'd learned about cooking, about balancing flavors and textures, about creating something that was both technically excellent and emotionally resonant. It was my culinary signature, the dish that would define me as a cook. The announcement came 3 weeks later. The regional culinary competition, open to amateur cooks, with a first prize of $10,000, and the opportunity to have the winning recipe featured in a major food magazine. I saw the flyer at the local gourmet market and felt my heart skip. This was it. This was the chance I'd been waiting for. I called Daniel as soon as I got home. "Did you see the competition announcement?" "Yeah, I saw it," he said, and something in his tone made me pause. "I'm thinking of entering with the lamb dish," I continued. "What do you think?" There was a long silence before he replied. "That's great, Sofia. I'm actually thinking of entering too." "Really? What dish are you planning to make?" Another pause. "I'm still deciding. Maybe that Mediterranean chicken thing I've been working on." I'd never heard him mention any Mediterranean chicken recipe, but I was too excited about my own plans to give it much thought. We talked for a few more minutes about the competition details, the judging criteria, the deadline for entry. His enthusiasm seemed muted compared to mine, but I attributed it to nerves. After all, this would be his first real cooking competition. The entry deadline was still 6 weeks away, which gave me plenty of time to perfect every element of the dish. I practiced obsessively, timing each component to ensure everything would come together flawlessly during the competition. I sourced the best ingredients I could find, testing different suppliers until I found the perfect lamb, the most fragrant saffron, the exact grade of bulgur that would give me the texture I wanted. Daniel checked in regularly during this period, always asking how the preparations were going, offering encouragement and advice. He even came over a few times to taste test iterations of the dish, providing feedback that was surprisingly insightful. I was touched by his support and found myself feeling closer to him than I had in years. "You're going to crush this competition," he told me after tasting what I considered my final practice run. "No one else will have anything close to this level of sophistication." 2 weeks before the deadline, I submitted my entry. The application required a detailed description of the dish, a list of ingredients, and an explanation of the cooking techniques involved. I spent hours crafting my submission, wanting to convey not just the technical aspects of the recipe, but the story behind it, the way it represented my culinary journey and my family's traditions. Daniel submitted his entry the same day. When I asked him what he'd decided on, he gave me a mysterious smile and said, "You'll see at the competition. I want it to be a surprise." The weeks leading up to the competition passed in a blur of anticipation and preparation. I practiced the timing until I could execute the dish flawlessly in the allotted time frame. I visualized every step, every moment, preparing myself mentally for the pressure of performing in front of judges and an audience. The night before the competition, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed running through the recipe in my mind, checking and rechecking my equipment list, imagining every possible scenario that might arise during the cooking process. When I finally dozed off near dawn, I dreamed of perfect glazes and approving judges, of holding a winner's trophy and seeing the pride in my family's faces. I arrived at the competition venue early, wanting to familiarize myself with the kitchen setup and claim the best workstation. The event was being held at the local Culinary Institute, a gleaming facility with professional-grade equipment and stadium seating for spectators. The energy in the room was electric. Dozens of amateur cooks unpacking their ingredients and equipment, each one convinced they had the winning recipe. I was arranging my spices when I saw Daniel across the room. He waved when he caught my eye, that same enigmatic smile on his face. Something about his confidence unnerved me, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was about my cooking, my dish, my chance to prove myself. Whatever Daniel was planning, I was sure my lamb recipe would speak for itself. The competition format was straightforward. 2 hours to prepare and plate one dish for a panel of 3 professional chefs. The dishes would be judged on taste, presentation, creativity, and technical execution. We were each assigned a number rather than cooking under our own names to ensure the judging would be blind. As I began my mise en place, arranging ingredients in the precise order I would need them, I noticed Daniel at the station next to mine. He was unpacking lamb, the same cut I was using. My stomach dropped as I watched him pull out pomegranate molasses, saffron, bulgur. The same ingredients, in the same quantities. My hands trembled as I continued my prep work, trying to convince myself it was a coincidence. Lots of Middle Eastern dishes used similar ingredients. It didn't mean anything. It couldn't mean anything. But as the clock started and cooking began in earnest, I watched in horror as Daniel began executing my recipe. Not a similar dish, not an inspired variation. My exact recipe, down to the specific marinade timing and the precise technique for creating the glaze. The betrayal hit me like a physical blow. Everything I'd shared with him, every technique I'd taught him, every secret I'd revealed during those collaborative sessions in my kitchen, he'd stolen it all. The notebook he'd brought, the questions he'd asked, the enthusiasm he'd shown. It had all been a calculated deception. I wanted to scream, to call him out right there in front of everyone, to expose him for the fraud he was. But the competition had started. The judges were watching, and I had 2 hours to cook the dish I'd created, while my own cousin prepared to present it as his own invention. The next 2 hours passed in a haze of rage and determination. I poured all of my fury into the cooking, channeling my anger into precision and focus. If Daniel thought he could simply steal my recipe and execute it better than I could, he was about to learn how wrong he was. A recipe is just words on paper. The soul of a dish comes from the cook who created it, who understands not just the what, but the why behind every component. I could feel Daniel watching me as I worked, no doubt comparing his execution to mine, looking for any advantage he could gain. But I had something he couldn't steal: the deep, intuitive understanding that comes from creating something from nothing, from months of experimentation and refinement, from cooking with love rather than ambition. My lamb went into the oven at the perfect moment, the marinade having penetrated exactly as deep as I knew it would. My bulgur cooked to the ideal texture, each grain distinct yet tender. The glaze came together like silk, coating the lamb with that perfect glossy finish that had taken me so long to master. As I plated the dish, arranging the candied walnuts and fresh herbs with the artistic eye I'd developed over years of practice, I could see Daniel struggling with his version. The glaze wasn't quite right, too thick in some places, too thin in others. His bulgur looked slightly overcooked, and his plating lacked the confident composition that comes from intimate familiarity with a dish. "Time," called the head judge, and we stepped back from our stations. The judging process was excruciating. We stood behind our dishes as the 3 judges, a James Beard Award winner, a local restaurateur, and a food magazine editor, tasted each entry methodically. They made notes, discussed quietly among themselves, gave no indication of their preferences. When they reached my station, I watched their faces carefully as they tasted. The first judge's eyebrows went up slightly, a good sign. The second judge took a larger second bite, savoring it thoughtfully. The third judge actually closed her eyes as she chewed, the way people do when they encounter something truly exceptional. "Beautiful balance of flavors," one of them murmured to another. "Excellent technique on the glaze." Then they moved to Daniel's station. I could see from their more neutral expressions that his version wasn't hitting the same notes. The glaze wasn't right, and they noticed. One judge left most of his portion unfinished. Another made a note that didn't look particularly positive. "The concept is interesting," I heard one of them say, "but the execution isn't quite there." As the judges moved through the remaining entries, I felt a mix of vindication and sadness. The vindication was obvious. My version of the dish was clearly superior to Daniel's stolen copy. But the sadness ran deeper, mourning not just the betrayal itself, but the relationship I'd thought we had, the trust I'd given so freely, the cousin I'd believed cared about me as more than just competition. The deliberation seemed to take forever. The judges huddled at the front of the room, tasting again, discussing, making final notes. The audience of family and friends who had come to support the contestants waited in tense silence. I could see my parents in the crowd, their faces tight with anxiety and anticipation. Finally, the head judge stepped forward with a microphone. "This was one of the most challenging competitions we've judged," she began. "The level of talent in this room is extraordinary, and there were several dishes that could have been winners in another competition." My heart hammered against my ribs as she continued. However, there was one dish that stood out not just for its ambitious flavor profile and technical execution, but for the obvious passion and understanding behind every element. The winner of this year's regional culinary competition is... The pause felt eternal. Contestant number 23. I looked down at the number pinned to my apron. 23. I had won. The room erupted in applause, but I barely heard it over the rushing in my ears. I had won. Not only had I won, but I had beaten Daniel's stolen version of my own recipe. The judges had been able to taste the difference between a dish cooked with genuine understanding and one executed as mere imitation. As I walked forward to accept my trophy, I caught Daniel's eye. His face was a mask of shock and humiliation, all pretense of friendly competition stripped away. For the first time, I saw him clearly, not as the cousin I'd loved and trusted, but as someone whose jealousy had consumed whatever genuine affection he might have once felt for me. The head judge handed me the crystal trophy and spoke into the microphone. "Would you like to tell us about your winning dish?" I looked out at the crowd, at my beaming parents, at Daniel standing frozen at his station, and felt a calm settle over me that I hadn't experienced since the competition began. "This dish represents my culinary journey," I said, my voice steadier than I'd expected. "It's inspired by my grandmother's traditions, but filtered through everything I've learned about technique and flavor balance. Each element was chosen and refined over months of experimentation, because I believe that great cooking isn't just about following a recipe. It's about understanding why each component works and how they come together to create something greater than the sum of their parts." I paused, looking directly at Daniel. A recipe can be copied, but the understanding that creates truly great food comes from passion, practice, and genuine love for the craft. That's something that can't be stolen. The applause that followed was thunderous, but I barely heard it. I was looking at Daniel, watching him absorb what I'd said, seeing the recognition in his eyes that everyone in the room now understood exactly what had happened. He didn't need to be called out explicitly. My words had said everything that needed to be said. As the crowd began to disperse and people came forward to congratulate me, Daniel disappeared. I didn't see him again that day, didn't hear from him for weeks afterward. When family members asked about the competition, I simply said that I was proud of my dish and grateful for the opportunity to compete. I didn't need to elaborate on the drama. The victory spoke for itself. In the days that followed, as the initial euphoria of winning faded, I found myself processing not just the betrayal, but what it had taught me about myself and my cooking. Daniel had stolen my recipe, but in doing so, he'd inadvertently proven something I'd always suspected, but never quite believed. That my cooking was special not because of any single recipe or technique, but because of the love and understanding I brought to every dish. The experience changed me in ways I'm still discovering. I became more protective of my work, more careful about what I shared and with whom. But I also became more confident in my abilities, more secure in my identity as a cook. The validation from the judges meant something, of course, but the more important validation came from within. The knowledge that I could trust my instincts, that my palate and technique were reliable guides. I started writing down my recipes more carefully after that, not just the ingredients and techniques, but the stories behind them, the inspiration and experimentation that led to their creation. That leather-bound journal became the foundation for what would eventually become my first cookbook, a collection of recipes that told the story of my culinary evolution and my family's traditions. The relationship with Daniel never recovered. We see each other at family gatherings now and exchange polite conversation, but the easy intimacy we once shared is gone. There's a wariness between us that everyone can sense, but no one discusses. My aunt still makes passive-aggressive comments about some people and their advantages, but they roll off me now like water off a duck's back. I understand now that some people will always see others' success as their own failure, will always look for ways to diminish, rather than celebrate achievements that remind them of their own limitations. But I've also learned that there's a kind of justice in the world of cooking that can't be subverted by theft or jealousy. Food doesn't lie. When you taste something cooked with genuine understanding and passion, you know, the judges knew. The audience knew. Even Daniel, in his heart, knew. 6 months later, I received a call from the food magazine that had sponsored the competition. They wanted to feature my winning recipe in their annual Best of the Best issue, along with a profile about my cooking philosophy and family influences. The photographer came to my grandmother's kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd first created the dish, and captured not just the final plated result, but the process of creation. The careful selection of spices, the precise timing of the marinade, the moment when the glaze achieves perfect consistency. Looking at those photographs later, I could see something in my face that hadn't been there before the competition. A quiet confidence, a sense of ownership over my craft that no one could take away from me. Daniel had tried to steal my recipe, but in the end, he'd given me something more valuable: absolute certainty in my own abilities and the knowledge that authentic creativity can't be replicated or stolen. The magazine article brought opportunities I'd never imagined: catering requests, invitations to food festivals, even inquiries from publishers interested in a cookbook. Each new challenge felt like a gift, a chance to explore new flavors and techniques while staying true to the principles I'd learned through that painful but ultimately liberating experience. I still make that lamb dish regularly, both for special occasions and just for the joy of creating something beautiful. Every time I prepare it, I remember not just the competition, but the entire journey that led to its creation. The failed experiments, the breakthrough moments, the sharing and teaching that I thought was building a bridge between me and my cousin, but was actually just feeding his envy. The taste is exactly the same as it always was. That perfect balance of sweet and savory, the tender lamb glazed to glossy perfection, the fragrant bulgur that carries the flavors without overwhelming them. But now it tastes like something else too: vindication, justice, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from knowing that true talent and authentic passion will always rise above imitation and theft. My cousin stole my recipe, but the judges chose mine. In the end, that's all that mattered. The truth always rises to the surface, like the perfect emulsion of honey and pomegranate molasses that creates a glaze no thief can truly replicate. Because you can steal techniques and ingredients, and even timing, but you can't steal the love that makes food transcendent. That belongs to the cook who creates it, who understands it, who lives it every time they step into their kitchen and transform simple ingredients into something magical. And that, I learned, is a recipe no one can steal.